this to.
Oh, good, they're live.
We might need one more chair. Awesome. Okay, I'm not a really good MC and not too practiced at doing this stuff.
I sort of sprang it on James at the last minute that I thought he should be the moderator because he knows this local context so much more than I do, but we've agreed to do it together. James, do you want to give a more fulsome introduction to our guests, or should everybody introduce themselves? Is that better?
Let's do that. So I'm James Steidle. I've, for those of you who don't follow the Facebook page, I kind of started this back in 2010. I grew up in Punchau, which is about an hour south of here, and there was some spraying activity with helicopters right around our property. And they came into the house and gave us the rigmarole about how basically what you heard the Monsanto lawyer up there say, how it's not dangerous and don't worry about it. We're just going to do a light pass and get rid of these aspen trees that are, changing the forest from what it was before, which was nonsense. And from that point on, I just kind of, having grown up in a logging industry and silviculture, having planted trees, I kind of, I've always liked aspen, and I was kind of skeptical of why we wanted to grow these pine plantations when we just had the pine beetle. Like, we're getting more pine on the landscape now than what we had before, and we just had a catastrophic pine beetle infestation. Like, made no sense to me, so I started to do some research into it and tried to do an article, and that never got published, so I just became a full-time activist. So that's kind of my background in that nutshell. Over to you, Tom.
My name's Tom Roberson. I've been a farm boy all my life, and am in silviculture and logging, and have been doing sheep grazing back in the 90s. And that's kind of my end.
Hey, I'm Bonnie Zawada. I grew up in and around Fraser Lake, Fort Fraser area. Again, farm girl. In the early 2000s, I acquired my first goat herd and had always wanted to do work with grazing with goats, and I was thinking more rural than forestry at the time. But now, combined with the two of us with the sheep and goats, we've come up with something really good.
Hi, I'm Kyle. Sorry, it's a little loud. I live in Fort Fraser, and we have been around in that area just, I guess, looking for berries to harvest and other things. And we've noticed quite a bit of an effect on our territory by logging. It seems to be overlogged quite a bit, and then to have it sprayed and monocultured is kind of really hard to see. I just wanted to share that, I guess. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Monica Buchanan, First Nations from this territory. I'm from Nicole Botten, just down the highway, I guess, up Tiers, Highway 16. Kyle and I, we both take our time to drive around and take care of our territory and see the differences and the changes and the effects that things are having, different kinds of things, including the herbicides bringing glyphosate, sorry. But yeah, Monica, nice to meet you.
My name's Nicole, and I recently completed my master's thesis research on the persistence of glyphosate in forest plant tissues. We published a paper in 2021 about the fact that it's persisting in perennial plants for a decade or more. That was the title of the paper. And without going into too much detail, we tested roots and shoots and also a couple of raspberries and blueberries, and it does persist for a long term.
I'm Jennifer, as you know, and I made this film. I'm a a filmmaker. I've been making films for about 30 years. This is my 10th feature, among a lot of other different projects, a lot of them environmental, some more arty, meditative. We made a film called Anthropocene, Watermark, Manufactured Landscapes, that were more kind of immersive experiential films. And we were actually at the Sundance Film Festival with Anthropocene when one of the lawyers who was on this case came, and I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "Well, these trials." And I said, "Who's documenting it?" And he said, "Nobody." And I was like, God, somebody's got to do that. And you know, it was a very complicated film to make in terms of, as I may have mentioned, the potential litigation or pushback from the company. So we had a lot of lawyers involved that combed through every single claim made in the film and made sure it was backed up by evidence, just like in court. So everything that you hear here, that it's not conjecture, it's not polemic, it's true. There's evidence to back it up. And I felt like it was really important to create a document of this David versus Goliath story for history. I know it's a complicated subject, especially here in forestry, but the bravery of Lee Johnson as a person to come forward in that way and tell his story, and all of those scenes, like the scene in the bedroom when he's getting ready, he wanted us to film that. That wasn't, he wanted us to know just how hard it is to get up in the morning. And it's hard to look at, but we wanted to do what he thought was necessary. He's better-ish. He's managing his symptoms now. He's not able to take chemo anymore. He's had like his limit of chemo. So he's on a kind of pill regime, and he seems to be doing okay, but not, he won't recover.
Jen, maybe I could just start off the questions with a question. There's been some recent developments in some glyphosate trials in Minnesota. How do those, or in I believe in Missouri, how do those impact this ongoing story? And I think the plaintiffs lost a couple. Are you keeping in touch with?
No, we do, and it's the same, like the whole thing about mass torts, this multi-district litigation, the executive comes together because the courts decide that, you know, they're not going to have individual trials for every single one of these thousands and thousands of cases. So they put together an executive that runs all of these trials together with one judge or two judges, and it's different. There's a federal judge, there's state judges, and in the beginning, these first three trials really went against the company in a bad way. And Bayer, you know, much to the surprise of its shareholders, bought Monsanto while Lee's trial was going on. They just didn't think that anything was going to happen. And now the company is worth less, Bayer is worth less than what they paid for Monsanto. So there's a lot of shit has hit the fan in terms of shareholders, et cetera. But they've started to win a few cases. And because of that, they're kind of emboldened. So there's been calls to do blanket settlements with the plaintiffs that are left who may not have their day in court. And Bayer is really pushing back and becoming much more bullish about the whole thing. But I will say that there's a study that is about to come out at the end of the year based in Italy that we already know has not great results for glyphosate. And that will have an effect on policy change, regulatory reviews, renewals in the EU, in the US, here in Canada, and internationally.
So one of the things I've noticed with forestry is we actually don't use Bayer or Monsanto products anymore. We use imported generic glyphosate products. Vantage Forestry is one of them, Glycil, And these are made offshore. A lot of this is made in China, which is actually a global leader in glyphosate production. And if you read about the industry there, there's quite a few concerns with pollution. Making glyphosate itself is quite a polluting enterprise. There's a lot of labor and environmental issues with that. And this is the stuff we're importing. It's worth noting that this stuff comes on shore in vats. Like, we're not batch testing this for purity. Okay, we don't really know what the surfactants they're using, which I think is a whole other aspect of this. Is like, we focus on glyphosate, but let's not forget that this is a formulation that we are using that includes surfactants and a bunch of other proprietary information I don't think is still being released. I think
Well, when they say that they're, and sorry, I want everybody else to talk, but when they say that they're going to phase it out of the commercial, the residential market by 2023, they're replacing the active ingredient in Roundup with something that's just basically like vinegar as a way of getting rid of that. But of course, it will still be available for industrial and agricultural use. And the surfactant, interestingly, like, there's an argument that the formulation of Roundup is more harmful than glyphosate itself, because, you know, surfactants are meant to penetrate, like they're meant to sort of soak in, right? And so they did these sort of studies with skin and the surfactant with glyphosate as opposed to just glyphosate, and it was a stronger result, but that was something that was not introduced at trial. I'd love to hear about Nicole's research, and also just, you know, some people could just say, so it persists, so what? It's still there. But the studies that we've been sort of following now, and the arguments that are being made, are not just arguments about carcinogenicity, but arguments about biodiversity loss. And maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about it. I don't really know where to start. There's I think so. My research didn't really look into that, about the half-life, but they do have, if anybody else here knows, I don't know if you know about the half-life in human body.
Well, I know that there was a study just recently that said that 80% of people on the planet have glyphosate residue in their urine, and that's people, children, whatever. I mean, it's sort of everybody. But why don't you speak to your research?
Okay. Well, going from there, I guess the reason why in the film he said that he was told you could drink it, right? That's been a long time thing that's been said. I think I heard about it. Somebody in Prince George way back then actually drank it, and it's water soluble, I think, and it will go through your body. They also talk. You asked about the half-life in the human body. There's also the question of the half-life in the environment. It's also thought that it won't persist in the environment. So a lot of in your film, there was the lawyers were talking about how Monsanto funded research that said that it's safe, not toxic, not carcinogenic, but also there's research saying it's not persistent in the environment. It'll won't stay in the soil, it won't stay in water. And to some extent you can see where they can get that argument from with half-life. But it's not as simple as that. As you say, it's the whole ecological question. So my research was about plant tissues, which there's a lot of research about agriculture. So these are mostly annual plants. So the studies in agriculture only look maybe a few months in length. And so when we're talking about forests, it's mostly perennial plants. And we're looking, we looked a year up to, from 1 year up to 12 years in duration. And well, basically at 1 year after operational treatment in forestry, all the plant samples that we tested that were from treated sites had glyphosate in them, and they were at pretty significant concentrations. I mean, it depends who you ask. I wouldn't say it's immediately toxic, but I would say that I mean, it's hard to say. So we consume glyphosate all the time, as you know, like all those foods that were listed, all the grains and legumes, and you know, the hummus that I had for lunch is not organic. I probably had a lot of glyphosate. I don't even know. So there are similar quantities of glyphosate in the forest plant tissues that we tested at 1 year after treatment, and then it decreases over time. But at 12 years after treatment, a few plant roots still contain glyphosate at low concentrations. And it's not necessarily a question of if it's immediately toxic to wildlife or to humans who are foraging out there, but it's a source in the environment, in our ecosystem, that was previously unaccounted for. And wildlife consuming it have a lot of demands on them. It's a cumulative effect that could be contributing to health issues that they have from other things, and the toxicity question. And also, my research also looked at nutrient changes from it, but that's a little different story.
This,
I read your report a while back, and forgive me if I'm just going to ask you if this is correct. I seem to recall that blueberries, I seem to recall in your reports that it said something like 30% of the blueberries collected a year after spraying had levels of glyphosate that would render it unfit for sale in public by public regulation.
Okay, yeah, that's going by the MRL. It's a maximum residue limit that the federal government and many countries, they set this limit for food products that if it, so it's 0.01 parts per million, I think, or is it 0.1? Anyway, it's
There's a set amount, and
Yeah.
and a third of the samples
yeah.
exceeded that.
I think it's about that. So 70% of the blueberry samples had glyphosate in them, and yeah, I think it might have been 26%. I think sounds right. Of all our raspberry and blueberry samples were above that amount.
Okay, and as far as I know, the government does not mark or map these areas that have been sprayed. So when people are collecting blueberries, they really have no idea what has been sprayed the year before.
that's correct, Herb.
I don't mean to interrupt or anything, but an experience that we had was that because I'm First Nation, we gather a lot of like huckleberries, blueberries, silkberries, and west, I guess like some people call it, a bunch of different kinds of plants and herbs, and we were trying to get maps from Forestry for areas we can avoid for this chemical that's being sprayed on things. And the Forestry and the actual sawmills wouldn't give me a map. I think James ended up giving me a map.
Yeah, and so, and Nicole, so what level, after 2 years, would it be below the prohibited limit, or 3 years, or what level, what time period would it take for blueberries to be absolutely safe for human consumption?
Well, I can't answer that, unfortunately, because we only tested the raspberries and blueberries at 1 year after treatment. When I did my field work up to 12 years post-treatment, it was, we did like a space for time substitution, so we went out all in 1 year, but we went out in July, and there weren't enough fruit ripe, so I went out the following year, and I was only able to collect a certain amount. So we went out in August that year, and we only collected from sites that were treated 1 year prior. So I would like to know, but yeah, I can't say for sure.
So I will just say that the PMRA, which is the pesticide management regulatory agency, which is part of Health Canada, is trying to raise the acceptable residue levels of glyphosate in food, and that is a big lawsuit that is going on right now. That we're involved with a bunch of NGOs who are challenging the government on that decision, and we'll see what happens. But that is something that will they have to make that decision this fall, and there's a lot of pushback against it.
Yeah, well, my understanding was that Monsanto originally said that there is no residue, right? Like basically, all this stuff would basically evaporate in the environment within days.
That
And it's
doesn't
not,
happen.
absolutely not true.
It's not true.
And yet, that's on that basis was why they were allowed to spray this stuff. And yet, we've proven that it persists in the environment. And the fundamental reason, or the basic reason why it was allowed to spray, as obviously was not true. And yet, they continue spraying.
Can we talk about alternatives to aerial spraying? I mean, it just seems like blanketing the whole areas feels like just like a kind of a sledgehammer, like a way too, an over reaction. Can you guys talk about your work and what you do and why it works? And why aren't we all doing that? Why aren't we doing that?
Okay, what we do, we take the sheep and goats out on the forestry cut blocks, and this is just something we've implemented.
Closer. A bit closer.
Right, you gotta
Point.
Closer. Ooh. And so we take the livestock out there and we move them across the cut blocks, and we eat the vegetation, and that releases the trees. What was your other question?
Well, why don't we do it anymore? Or why is it not common? And I think somebody else in the audience might have something to say about that. We'll get to Dennis here. What's the theory? Why is it?
It's way beyond me. Why we don't do it.
Capitalism.
Dennis, you want to give us a rundown, Dennis? Like, they can try to do it in 2 minutes? 3 minutes? Maybe 5?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dennis Loxton. I've been a silvicultural contractor in BC for about 50 years. First of all, I had 200 tree planters, and we planted for 17 years. But my trade in Australia before I came here was I'm a wool grader. It means I sort out sheep's wool. It's a 4-year course. It meant I was running around in outback shearing sheds for about 6 years. And we had some terrible droughts. I saw more dead sheep than everyone has seen live sheep. And then I came out to BC, went tree planting, turned into a contractor. And the whole time I'm looking at all this amazing vegetation. And since I'd just come from terrible droughts in Australia, dead sheep everywhere, I was looking at this vegetation that's bloody 6 and 8 feet high, and just going, oh, whoa, look at all the vegetation. And then I would start talking about bringing sheep onto plantations, and that was just the biggest joke in BC. So anyway, we kept planting trees, but eventually an old guy in 100 Mile House was able to get the Ministry of Forests to give him a small contract for about 150 sheep out of 100 Mile House, and he was able to prove to the forestry that sheep don't eat seedlings. And so when I heard that, I just went, wow, here we go. There's some of the plantations we'd planted 3 times that simply died from competing vegetation. And the forestry, they just wanted to spray everything. And I kept saying, no, what about sheep, what about sheep? Anyway, eventually I quit tree planting contracting. The next day I was a sheep contractor. I rented 3,600 sheep, and we did 3 contracts, divide them into flocks of 1,200 per flock, and it was great. The next year we got more contracts. We upped it to 6,000 sheep, and we kept it at 6,000 sheep for the next 16 years. Meant I was able to turn my 3 sons into shepherds, and we trained young Canadians to be shepherds, and these kids were bloody amazing. Now, the one thing I want to say for sure, Canada has a really high quality sheep. The vegetation on these plantations is very high protein. It's all they need. They don't need to be their food to be subsidized with grain or something. the guardian dogs that I always thought the bears and predators would be the reason this wouldn't work. It turns out the guardian dogs just simply chase them away. Canada already has excellent guardian dogs. Herding dogs, I thought I was going to have to import them from Australia, but somebody had already brought them in here 50 years ago, so they were already here. Everything we needed was already here. We didn't have to invent anything. So we'd divide the flocks into 1,500 sheep, 3 shepherds, you know, pickup truck, water troughs, whatever, and that would be a project, and that project would graze off 400 to 500 hectares per 90 or 100-day season. So we had 4 of these flocks, all Canadian shepherds, and it worked, and I could not see anything wrong with it. The only thing I see wrong with it is that spraying Roundup with a helicopter is cheaper, and that is why we're out of business. We got this industry. I was taking out 6,000 sheep, but different mates of mine, like these guys, got in it, and between us, we're taking out 50,000 sheep in BC every summer. Now, considering the biggest sheep farmer in BC has 1,000, and he's had 1,000 sheep for 150 years, 3 or 4 generations. As far as I'm concerned, they've proven that sheep do well in Canada. And anyway, we had 50,000 sheep out there. And now, well, this year, Tom and Bonnie had 200 sheep out there. And that's, so it's gone from 50,000 down to 0, now to 200. As far as I'm concerned, the potential is infinite. I cannot see anything wrong with it, and I can't see any reason why BC shouldn't be farming, say a number, 1 million sheep. And sheep are high protein. BC has a food security problem that nobody's talking about. My belief was if there was sheep farms all across Canada or all across BC, there wouldn't be any need for Roundup on any plantations in BC, and people, Canadians would have food security. Anyway,
Can Bonnie talk a bit about the experience that you were telling us at dinner, where you were just in conjunction with that story? And also, it would be great to know how much cheaper it is. Like, how much are we talking in terms of, but do you want to talk about your being up there and the dogs and, you know?
Yeah, the dogs were amazing. We had, I have to say, with the sprayed blocks around us, there's not as many berries on them. We did have a quick look. So being that we were on a block that was not sprayed, we had a fair number of berries. So that is a huge attraction for the wildlife, for the bears. And our dogs were busy. They worked all night, slept all day. There were days where they were busy during the day as well. And they just kept them pushed back. We never had a confrontation with the bear. We've seen the bears. We've heard the dogs busy with the bears more than we've seen them. But we did not lose a sheep or a goat to a bear. We did not hear wolves or coyotes out there, so we can't speak to those. But yeah, the bears were incredible out there, and those dogs were amazing. They just kept them pushed back, and I felt safe out there all the time. It was an awesome job. We were out there for 46 days this year, and they made a huge impact on the area that we did cover. They came out of there looking good. We're really happy with it. So,
Monica, you've been successful in stopping spraying. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? What your process was?
Yeah, I think it was Kyle and I, and probably whoever else, but what do you call it? We did talk to the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Forestry. I think this confuses me, I guess I'm gonna say it. I think, I know BC is unceded, and so I don't see why these companies and these corporations feel like they can come here and spray these territories and kill all the organisms that keep the life abundant in these areas. I don't get it. But that's part of my conversation with West Fraser was, what were they doing? And they responded by stopping spraying and in the area, and they wrote us a declaration so that we could take them to court if they were lying. And yeah, it worked, it helped. So, what do you think, Kyle?
Yeah, I think that was really great. Like, West Fraser was happy to sit down with Monica and I and talk about some issues. Canfor wasn't so helpful. When Monica tried to contact Canfor, they didn't want to change anything unless the legislation was changed, which is something we could all be a part of, is changing the legislation so that this isn't something they can do easily. Yeah, I'd like to see the areas in BC not sprayed, just like James.
Yeah.
I just want to go back a little bit. This is my inexperience as an MC. I promised Monica I would not forget to say this tonight, and that's that we're on the unceded territory of the Clay Tene. And I think that's a really important point that I think we all got to remember. And for these corporations to not only, spray the stuff when we ask them not to, but they don't even bother to tell us where.
Honestly, it's like reaping. They're reaping the environment and the earth and like all the animals and everything on it. And you're telling them no, stop, and nobody's listening. And it's just really frustrating. And I'm glad for people like you guys and everyone who seems to care. That gives me hope. But yeah.
And shout out to Dennis as well. I mean,
Thanks,
I think
Dennis.
like the work that you did to kind of get this pioneered.
It's crazy that it's not happening now. I mean, does anybody have any questions from, oh, there's one right there.
Oh, sorry, 1 second.
Hi, Monica.
Hi.
So my question is, it's one thing to talk about spraying the landscape to create a specific landscape that our government has mandated. Can you please talk about the biodiversity connected, what we lose, and are we going to lose that no matter how we manufacture that landscape to meet those government targets of conifer-only plantations?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, for me, I guess, what I think of is farming, I guess. They spray the glyphosate on the fields, and it actually kills the worms and the organisms that set the pH for the dirt so that you can grow healthy plants. I've watched documentaries where they talk about how they do regenerative farming where they have animals eating the grasses and stepping on the dirt to add air into it, and it actually affects the pH of the earth and makes it have more protein and more substance and nutrition, I guess you could say. That's one thing, and then there's moose too. I mean, like, I was taught hunting and stuff like that, and so one thing that we've noticed as First Nations is like tumors in the meat. And yeah, like moose and deer and stuff like that, things you don't want to eat or consume. And I'm not saying that it's proven from glyphosate or anything, but I'm saying that is not helping with the moose for sure. Like, I don't know what it is. It's something that we're doing, I think. Yeah.
There is, I'll just say, and I'm going to try not to make this too much of a digression, but when we were doing the film where we had to be so careful about the claims that were made, there's a thing when they're talking about discovery, and discovery was that process where they went through 15 million documents with the AI because nobody would be able to go through those. And in the old days, it was teams of lawyers in an airplane hangar with bankers' boxes going through files. And so now the ability to comb through all of that information faster, and it actually, as Ray says, Art Cravella, he's like a mafia don. I mean, he looks like that, but he says the AI gets better and better the more that it does. And one of that's how the Monsanto papers were discovered. But one of the elements is there's this level at which, called Daubert, that evidence has to reach that level of credibility before it can be introduced into court, so peer-reviewed journals, et cetera. And there's two things that that we went through that we really wanted to put in the film that we couldn't because it wasn't introduced in court because it didn't reach that level. It was sort of just below. And one of them was this incredible researcher, scientist at the University of Texas, Dr. Nancy Moran. And all she does is study the gut microbiota of bees. Like, I didn't even know that bees had guts, but they do. And there's microbiota in those guts, which allows adolescent bees to digest pollen in order to grow. And if they can't digest the pollen, then they don't grow, they don't get big enough, they don't become adult worker bees. And glyphosate kills the microbiota in their guts. So they're smaller, they become disoriented, they don't go back to the hive. And it's this, when just like neonics that kill bees sort of instantly, glyphosate just takes longer, so they don't say that it is toxic to bees because it doesn't happen right away. So that was one study we couldn't put in. And we were able to put in the film the Krefeld Entomological Society that has really, as you saw, mapped a 70% decline in insects over a period of 30 years. But the other thing that we wanted to add was in the early 2000s, Monsanto started to market glyphosate as a desiccant on crops before harvest. So not just spraying plants when they're growing anymore, but actually to evenly dry out crops before harvest, which then spiked the residue levels in food, number one. And number two, it was the first time it was being sprayed directly on food. And there is a correlation between celiac disease, gluten intolerance, Crohn's, irritable bowel, that happened at around the same time that farmers started to spray glyphosate directly on crops to dry them out. And I think that there is a lot of research, we were talking about this at dinner, that is being done on the gut microbiome on guts in general, not just in humans, in animals, in insects, microbiota in the soil. And I think that we're sort of at a new threshold of understanding how that works and understanding how chemicals in our environment affect those natural processes.
Quick question for you. It's my understanding that actually the public pays for the forestry. My understanding is that the public pays for the glyphosate that the forestry companies are using on
Yeah, it all comes off stumpage. So everybody here in this room, we're all paying for this when they spray it on our forests. And I think that's a really important point. When the government gave responsibility for reforestation to the corporations in 1987, there's a big shift in who basically got to organize the silviculture activities. It was given to corporations, but it wasn't like the responsibility for funding that was given to them. It just came off stumpage, right? We just reduced the stumpage for them. And every year, I don't know exactly, I haven't seen the regulation on how this works, but there is a stumpage appraisal manual, and there's a silviculture cost that is calculated in there how to figure out what the stumpage costs. And as far as I know, every few years, the companies send the bill for what they spent on silviculture, and that comes off the stumpage. And if they reduce that amount, then they lose it. Yeah.
So the more they spray, the lower their silviculture costs and the higher stumpage.
Okay, so they have a benefit in spraying.
So I know that the cost of aerial spraying is roughly about $350 a seen crews out there without any protective gear whatsoever, okay, that runs about $700 a hectare.
Well, it's a cheaper way to do it, right? And I think one of the arguments I would make is if it is more expensive to run sheep, how about we just reduce some of these requirements for the conifer plantations? Why don't we accept some more fire-resistant aspen in these cut blocks? I mean, right now the rule says it's got to be 95% conifer dominated in the regulation. Like why don't we allow 10%? Like, is that going to be the end of the forestry industry if we, double the amount of aspen we can have? Right now, the biggest aspen patch that you're allowed on any clear cut under every single major forest stewardship plan in the central interior is 2 hectares. And that requires extra work. So usually it's just 1 hectare that's allowed to exist in these cut blocks. Like, that's ridiculous. Let's get some bigger patches of aspen out there in the landscape for fire resistance, for moose habitat. They sequester more carbon, they absorb less solar radiation, they absorb more moisture. Like, when there's rainfall events, more water gets through the canopy of aspen than conifer. So I mean, that's one way I think that we can balance things out. We can do more expensive manual brushing, more expensive sheep grazing, and we loosen it up a little bit on the conifer plantation mentality. But of course we don't want to do that, because the quicker we can get these plantations growing, the more we can log today, right? And I think that's the whole trap that we're caught in with forestry, is that, and the whole basis for this really intensive conifer plantation model is to juice up the models, the TIPSY model, which is a computer program that foresees how much timber we're going to have 50, 60, 70 years from now.
My guess is that if you actually made the corporations pay for glyphosate themselves, or the spraying themselves, that they'd find a way to eliminate it.
Yeah, or give them a certain amount of money to get a forest to get to a certain stage of free growing, and say, you know what, you can pocket the difference if you get it to that stage, because right now it doesn't work like that.
Well, I don't think we should be giving them any money in the forestation.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, if you had a different incentive, you could.
Yeah, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Basically, when the public pays, they have no incentive to do anything differently.
Yeah.
So if they were actually absorbing the cost of reforestation, they would find cheaper and better ways to do it. But because we are incentivizing them through public money to spray, they basically continue on year after year after year.
So I just want to add one other thing, that just about
Yeah.
we were talking about, Jen was talking about the new studies looking at bee guts and the microbiome. Like, there's so many different aspects of forestry spraying that we have no idea about. At dinner, I was talking about mycorrhizae, like fungi in forests, and what impact glyphosate has on fungi. And we should do a little shout out to Suzanne Simard. I'm sure most of you guys have heard of her, but she's kind of the pioneer of a lot of the Stop the Spray B.C. work. She was one of the first ones I talked to, and she'd been researching this stuff for decades. Back in the 90s, she started researching glyphosate, and she's really led to a huge discovery in how important these mycorrhizae are to forests and how trees and plants communicate with each other. We've done one study in the boreal forest looking at spraying and its impact on mycorrhizae. And that's an article by Tanny and Hutchison from 2010. And they found that 50% of the mycorrhizae died at field doses. That's the only study we've ever done on that. So it's just insane that how little we know about this practice.
Does anybody else have a question?
I just want to finish up on the costs, though.
Yeah.
I think,
Sorry, could you press the button on the left on that microphone? It seems that somebody's moving it.
Right.
Okay. I'd like to ask Dennis what the costs of sheep shepherding would roughly per hectare. Do you can give us a ballpark?
No, I don't know. Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer. It is more expensive than Roundup, no matter how you do it. It's less expensive than manual brushing. Actually, one thing that needs mentioning at this point, I forgot to say before, is
Just don't forget the cost of fertilization.
yeah, I don't know. Obviously, all that unbelievable density of vegetation is turned into sheep fertilizer, which is actually really good for everything, and spread evenly all over the plantation. But also we use the logging landings as bedding grounds, and of course there's all kinds of sheep manure on there, and it turns out it rehabs the landings. But another thing is that in Alsea, Oregon, they did some experiments to see what impact sheep grazing on fir plantations had, what impact it had on the wildlife population and habitat. It turns out that it really, sheep grazing on plantations enhances wildlife population and habitat. That's their conclusion. They spent a fortune doing it. And what it was about was, once you graze off the summer, vegetation, of course it grows again, but it never goes to seed. It's always young and fresh and high in protein. And the elk and whatever ungulates eat that before they go into winter. And what it's actually found it did was that a sudden boost of protein triggered more twinning. They had more twins. And also the older ones lived longer. They had another set of twins before they, anyway. So to me, it looks like it just goes on and on and on, the benefits to sheep veg management. I've been beating my head against the wall for the whole time I've been talking about it, and I have retired. I am sick of the bullshit. But for me, I've put in my time, lost my shirt doing this, and I am convinced that there's a huge sheep veg management industry just waiting to happen, and it's about when Canadians get their shit together to put a stop to this bloody nonsense and start actually really farming this place. Anyway, thank you for letting me be so rude.
Just thank you. Tom or Connie, do you know the approximate cost per hectare?
Not right at the moment. You have to, it's going to be between spraying and hand brushing.
Right.
So
No.
I think
Somewhere-
spraying is 500 a hectare, brushing is 800 to 1,000, I think.
Yeah.
Melissa, do you know?
So you're saying it's in between those two. So it's a little bit more, but not as much as hand picking.
Right, but it depends, like every site is specific, but to gear up to do this, the forest companies have got to say, okay, we got to do this.
Yeah,
And I can't go out there for 1 year and spend
right.
a
No.
shitload of money to do this, and then the next year say, no, we don't want it.
Right, right.
And I do know that Canfor spent over $1,000 per hectare doing, applying applying fertilizer by helicopter. So if you start looking at the fertilizer costs, all of a sudden the sheep makes sense.
That was the
Does
government
it
paid for that.
ever?
It's a different product. You can't compare.
It's like comparing apples to oranges. Like, to go out there and spray, it's easy. And that's what people like to do. They like to take the easy road. And sheep grazing is not easy. You're out there, you're up 12 to 14 hours a day, you're out there all summer. You're losing weight, getting in shape, and you're on guard all the time. You have your downtimes. But it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of people don't want to do that kind of work. And so people avoid it. So let's do the easy thing. Let's go out there and spray the shit out of everything. No. We can't be doing that. So, yeah, it's not an easy thing to get started.
And you want it to be sustainable. You want to be able to
Yes.
say, I'm doing this for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
Does
Well,
anyone have any other, there's a question
Oh.
there. I'm just trying to get.
Coming
other-
up, Anita.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna say something real fast. Sorry, what was your name again? Bonnie? Okay. I have to say I'm glad you're out there because we really worry about like contamination to the medicines that we use that already giving to sick people, you know, you don't want to give them something bad that'll hurt their stress or anything. And I feel sorry for the animals. They eat this stuff, they're getting sprayed in this stuff. Someone told me they don't even consider the wetlands along the highway from Prince George to Fort Fraser wetland, so they spray it. And I see all kinds of wildlife in those ponds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, I think we've already heard the point made, but sheep grazing is great as an alternative, but I think the bigger change, the shift in management that we need to be pushing for is to allow nature to be nature and to let the diversity be there. Let trees grow with each other and have the full network working together.
Yeah, that's a great point. Selective logging instead of clear cutting. Having more seed trees left behind that can, was it 150 meters you can reliably count on trees to do natural seeding? So when you have these huge clear cuts with no seed trees, then you become reliant on tree planting. So if you had more patches around, you could conceivably rely less on silviculture.
Well, it's something with forestry, not to interrupt you, but with cut blocks that they're spraying and stuff like that, like we went looking for birch because we sew with birch bark and we make jewelry and baskets, and we use all kinds of plants for all kinds of things, and we're looking for some of them and we cannot find them because it's taking like 50 minutes of driving around looking for a birch tree because they cut them all down. And it's like forestry did not address our people for what we utilize and what we value. They just spray, and it's pretty horrible. Yeah, so.
Well, it's also, I mean, that question of we're talking about costs and stuff. We externalize so much in terms of cost. So when you think about that, like, okay, you have to do tree planting because there's no self-seeding kind of thing. And if you really take into account the whole ecosystem, you can't put a price on it like that. It's not just about money, right?
Actually, you can put a price on it because the public pays for tree planting as well as spraying.
And the roads.
And the roads.
So again, this is where we really have to start looking at forest policy in BC, and why is the public funding forest companies?
I agree with you. I have to say, like, with not to change the subject on reconciliation or anything, but I don't get why the Canadian public is trying to say that they want to reconcile when they are doing things that we're asking them to stop. Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see them, sorry. I don't believe in that unless it's with the individual, I guess, to show respect for that kind of thing. But I think it's costing a lot. I'm not the only person who feels this way. A lot of people wonder why are the people laying dormant to this obviously messed up government that's being capitalist and even poisoning their own people, right?
Yes?
I'm just curious, years of working with not with Monsanto, but in terms of the legal action, have you seen sales in glyphosate and various products go down? I mean, people have been aware that it's a problem, and are they not just stopping to buy?
Well, it's interesting because the residential market has become somewhat compromised. Like there's some companies now that are not selling glyphosate, I think. I'm not sure if it was Walmart or Costco or one of the big chains just stopped. And then, you can still get it in the hardware store, but there are places where now it's sort of restricted in use. And it's a somewhat cynical move of Bayer to remove it from the residential formula because they think that's their major problem, all these, dumb consumers that aren't treating it properly. They're farmers, industrial use, all of that golf courses, as you saw in all the places where it's sprayed. It will still be available for all of that, and though that's continued to be bought. Now, when glyphosate went off patent, as James said, you know, a lot of people don't buy the Roundup formula anymore or the Ranger Pro. They go to the generics, and that's different. But there's still enough profit. It was their biggest seller for almost, you know, it was first introduced in the mid-70s, and I think it's still a massive seller for them. And now they're changing it because it's just not worth the hassle of the lawsuits. Yeah?
Yeah, just give you a different angle. I was a safety coordinator in the legislature at the CN. And when I was in the union, so we used to fight about all the chemicals that were being used. And so we do it through the safety committees, and what would happen is they would just come back and say those chemicals were approved by Health Canada. So if it's approved by Health Canada, they could spray it. I saw them spray tons of stuff, and I saw workers get sick, and you cannot fight those corporations because it's approved. And I watched CN for 30 years, and what they would do is, in which all the corporations do, because they have incredible power, is that if they take one product off the market, they put another one on, and they just change the names, the ingredients, and they spray again, and the end result was the same. And I can remember back in the 70s out at Hickson, and it was BC Rail, but my friend lived there, and there was swallows that went into the cut banks there, and he went by there one day, and there was probably, he said 1,000 birds were dead, so they raised a lot of commotion, and we actually thought it was Agent Orange because CN apparently did use that.
God.
I mean, but you know, like we thought that stuff.
It's true, like the PFOAs and stuff that you just change. It's not called Teflon anymore. It's got some other name, and it's just changed in a minor way, but it's still carcinogenic.
And the thing, if you go back with CN, because I hired on there in the 60s, and back then the trains were shorter, so when you put the brakes on, you didn't get the sparks.
Right.
Once the trains got longer and you got the sparks, then a forest fire would crop up, right? So now to prevent those forest fires, what are you going to do along the right-of-way? You're going to spray the hell out of it, kill everything off so there's nothing there. I mean, it's a long story. But I sort of think what you guys are doing is really good, but I think there are other advocates out there in the unions. I retired 25 years ago, so I don't really know how active they are, but.
Well, I will say that if and I'm not just advocating that you all scan this QR code for vanity, but in the next, I would say in the next week or so, there's an action that we're trying to do that is directed towards regulatory change in Canada that I can't talk about right now because it's not completely approved, and I would love if everybody here could be involved in that when it happens. And it is true. But the reason that the film sort of delves into the issue of regulatory capture is really important because it is true that these agencies that are meant to be protecting us, in fact, are kind of working for industry, and that is something else that we have to attack, and we also have to bring it out of this idea that mass torts is the only way to deal with these things, with lawyers like these lawyers that put up millions of dollars on spec in case that, if they win or they don't win. Why aren't these people going to jail is my question. Like, why aren't there criminal charges against the heads of corporations that allow this kind of thing to happen?
Well, it's approved by Health Canada and the government, so they just hide behind that. You can't go after those corporate heads, because I've been in their think tanks. I know how it works.
But this is somewhat of a success
Oh, no,
story.
it was.
Yeah.
I agree. It was, the problem for me was it was in the States.
Yes.
And the breakdown for me is we didn't fight the government through the lawyers. You had to go through WCB and you had to go through Health Canada.
Yes.
And then the corporations go through that, and then you've got Transportation Safety Board and all those regulators involved in it. It's a really complex thing to fight those guys, but I think you guys are doing a really good job. I think there are other advocates there. It's, I don't know how you get at them, but
there's an interesting example. Monica forwarded me an email from the Ministry of Agriculture. Monica had written him about concerns with herbicide use, and what he sent you back a genetic literacy project fact sheet. So I don't know if you noticed on the movie there real quickly that the Genetic Literacy Project is a front group for Monsanto and other agrochemical companies, and they provide free propaganda for governments. And I called that guy up. I said, why are you giving members of the public genetic literacy project propaganda? And his argument was basically, well, I'm here to protect the producer. You know, the producer. The producers need this stuff, and that's who I work for, basically, was what he said. I wish I had recorded the conversation, but to any government people out there, I don't record the conversations.
I mean, the other part of that is that there are a lot of regulatory reviews coming up, and I do think that these trials have had an impact on that. I mean, the EPA is being now forced to review glyphosate for biodiversity and carcinogenicity. The EU is set to either reapprove or not reapprove glyphosate for use. It's supposed to be by the end of the year, but they've pushed it now to July because they're waiting on this study, this particular Italian study, and a couple of other things. And we're really hoping to, use the film as a tool to bring in these studies and things that people know in order to influence policy review. I don't know if it's going to work. You know, we're screening in Washington, we're screening in Boston, we're screening in Brussels, we're screening in Ottawa, we're screening in Montreal during the Biodiversity Summit COP in December. So, you know, that's all you can do.
Well, I think actually a lot of people
could you give the mic to Cheryl behind you there, please?
There, you got a hand.
And then the back, there you go.
I recognized Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and Daniel Lanois as the musicians and maybe arrangers, Daniel Lanois. So having celebrities like that, is that part of the idea, is to get known people to be part of this? And could you do more of that? Because that's often, especially for young people, a real catch to start to pay attention to this kind of issue?
Well, I think young people are they're listening to The Weeknd, not to Neil Young. However, Neil Young is a real anti-Monsanto activist, and I think when we go to the States, we'll try. As I told you at lunch, we got his song, which was, I did one of, my argument for him charging less was that it's not a very good song, but that wasn't, that didn't fly. We still had to pay quite a lot of money for it. But Daniel Lanois, actually, we did a barter thing with him. So he's working with Leonard Cohen's son to do, because Leonard has recorded his poems and in his own voice. And so Daniel is putting them to music. And so he made this one, he did to music this beautiful poem called Torn Again, and then asked us to make a film about it, so that we just to put visuals with it. And then because we did that, he said, so what can I do for you? And we said, well, give us 2 cues for our film. And when he did that, so the scene with Lee in the bedroom is Daniel Lanois, and he just basically improvised it as he was watching that scene. And it's sort of, the music is kind of perfect for that. There are advocates, like we have Naomi Klein, who's a supporter, who's a friend of ours. Margaret Atwood is she's got 3 million Twitter followers. She's a supporter. We're hoping to have, so Elliot Page is somebody who's done a lot of work on water and pesticides. Cory Booker in the US is probably going to be on our panel in Washington. I mean, we're just trying to muster as much as we can, quite frankly. So if anybody has any ideas, happy to hear them.
Stop mowing your lawn. Be an example to your neighbors and let all the weeds grow.
There's a question.
Oh yeah, come on up.
Hello? Yeah, I think somebody asked the cost comparisons between manual brushing, chemical, and sheep grazing. Here are the numbers. This was a number worked by one of my grad students, and the paper was presented in Germany and it's published in Agroforestry Systems 2014.
Damn technology.
Chemical brushing, aerial, the numbers range from, that is cost per hectare, dollar per hectare, 154 to 213. The average cost, dollar per hectare, is 182. Chemical brushing ground, 264 to 631. And the average cost is 447. And then manual brushing, 301 to 873. The average cost is 625. And then sheep grazing, 223 to 388, and the average cost is 305. Wow. So those are the numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's got to be old information.
No, this is 2014. We checked all the numbers. The
There's
numbers
been
could
no
go
sheep-
up.
There's
Yeah.
been no sheep grazing for 20 years.
Well, we look at that one. I'm doing this because it's a paper that a grad student just finished last year. Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to see that
Yeah.
paper.
I think
And then
put it up on our website.
we have done a lot of work this in agroforestry. I know Dennis Loxford, we did a lot of work on sheep grazing around Fort and James there and so on. So those numbers could vary from there because of region, but it gives you some of the bottom line. The bottom line is chemical brushing is cheapest. Okay? It's cheapest because that's why people do it. And then followed by sheep grazing and then manual brushing. So documentary like this, I think, is very educational and then makes people aware of, and people can make informed decisions. So I hope more of this could be done. Somebody mentioned work that was in Fraser Lake. I'm very pleased that what was done. I did some work there on manual brushing. I'm a strong advocate of manual brushing and sheep vegetation, And where we have public pressure, like around Fort and you will get those initiatives being taken, like manual brushing and sheep vegetation management. But chemical weeding, I think it needs a lot of education. I've been in this place for 27 years. I know what I'm talking about. It involves a lot of discussion where all the stakeholders should be involved and then people make the trade-offs. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. One thing I noticed about, with this herbicide spraying south of town, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Blackwater area, like they were spraying stuff that they didn't need to spray. And I think maybe the idea that, this is cheap, I think it led to a bit of overuse. And, going after aspen patches that actually weren't even out of compliance with the rules, because we've never touched our woodlot, right guys? And Canfor sprayed all around our woodlot. We never touched a single aspen. We never even brushed it, and it's free to grow. So I think a lot of the spraying was administrative brushing, where you're doing it just for the hell of it. And even if it is cheap, at the end of the day, the government still pays for it. It still comes off the stumpage. So these companies aren't necessarily incentivized not to spray. If they've got the budget to do it, they'll do it. And like you said, Melissa, it's your silviculture goes down, your stumpage goes up. So it's no real difference, it's a wash, right? So if the company has a choice between keeping our silviculture department employed by doing more brushing than necessary, or just paying more stumpage, they're going to keep their silviculture guys working. That's the way the system's set up. It's a ridiculous price mechanism and financing mechanism.
Those numbers don't include the cost of fertilization. Every time you're taking wood off of land, you're taking nutrients off of that.
Yeah, especially if it's deciduous, which aspen is associated with arbuscular mycorrhizae. Actually, all deciduous ecosystems are associated with much higher arbuscular mycorrhizae, which is free fertilizer. That's associated with the highest productivity, the highest nitrogen fixation. I mean, that's why aspen's a weed, right? It grows too fast. It's sequestering too much carbon. It's like 500% more carbon sequestration. So I think the big question we got to ask is, why aren't we utilizing aspen? Why aren't we utilizing cottonwood or birch? Why don't we have an OSB mill in town? Every single house in Prince George is made with OSB. It's all imported from either the Peace or Alberta, where they do utilize aspen. So it's another part of it.
Were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, I don't know why people are spraying the forest and the animals and all their food and everything and killing everything, when a lot of the politicking and like the political elective side of the MLAs and stuff like that is jobs, jobs, jobs. Everybody wants jobs, but I don't see that either. I mean, because you can manually take this stuff out too, right?
Well, that would be another argument. I just have a question. Is there anybody in this room from the forestry industry? Okay, can you stand up and talk? and tell us about...
How about I sit down and talk?
Okay, well, so do you totally disagree with everything that we're saying?
I think there's a lot of confusion about what a free-growing tree looks like. So the reason we spray is not because of legislation, it's a business model. So Canfor has a business model that is, we log it, we plant it, we log it, we trench it, we plant it, and 5 years later we spray it. No questions asked, because that's what gets me finished faster. We don't have to do that. We can do other things. A free-growing tree is one that has no brush within a 1 meter circle. It's not that there's no other trees on the block, it's that it's brush-free in a 1 meter circle. That's it. So we don't need to brush everything, you're right. We don't have to spray anything, but we do have to do some brushing, a little bit of brushing. And it can be manual.
There's
So-
no but goats are for, not to interrupt. I mean, there's no but sheep do and stuff.
Well,
What
but
about the
they're
goats
not,
and sheep?
Yeah.
but they won't target the right species. So you're not targeting large deciduous trees. So lots of our brushing, if we're going to use manual brushing, we're going to be doing it at the 6 to 15 year mark, because the trees do quite well on their own, right? They were designed to grow. So they grow, and as long as they don't get suppressed by your herbaceous brush, they'll be fine until they start to maybe get a little bit competed out at the year 10 to year 15. And then we might have to do a little bit of brushing. But if we're manually brushing, we're not going through and brushing everything. We are specifically brushing these 2 trees so that conifer will grow, or deciduous will grow, because we do have stocking standards with deciduous in them.
So do you think so are you going to go back and say that that's what you guys should do from now on? That
I
you're
already
gonna-
do.
What?
We already do.
Well, but you also spray.
I don't work for Canfor.
There's only one company that sprays in this region.
Right.
So
Canfor.
my clients, I don't think I've had a client spray in probably 5 years, and the only ones that did was very minimal.
So, Melissa, that's my sister, by the way. So that's where I get a lot of my forestry education. You had a really good quote about helicopter pilots doing the work of RPFs. What was that? What was your quote there?
So basically, the people who decide where to spray is the helicopter pilot. So Canfor, or anybody who does aerial spraying, will usually do I don't spray, so I don't really know all the legislation requirements, but we have to do a pest management thing, a map, which is legally required to be given to you if you ask for it. And then they give it to their helicopter pilot and the foresters in the office. And then the helicopter pilot sprays and misses the riparian areas. So they decide when to turn it on and turn it off.
So the helicopter pilot's pretending they're an RPF.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not cool.
Oh, that's a big question. So,
on those terms, before you answer that,
yeah.
is it true that the seeds were modified so that instead of taking 125 years to grow, it takes 80 years to grow, which then affects not just the tree and density and, well, life around it? Is this all connected also to this? Because if British Columbia being the biggest, well, one of the biggest logging things in the world, would their hands be direct with that as well? So we're not just dealing with pesticides, we're also dealing with the fact that they run trees.
No, so no, there's no GMO trees in BC. We do breed trees, so our seed is bred. It's just like a farmer. So we choose stock that does things well, and then we breed them with other stock that does things well, and then that's our seed lot. So BC actually has a really cool seed program. We collect it, it all gets stored in Surrey, in the Surrey Seed Bank. We have kilograms of seed there. And then we have tree improvement centers, of which there's actually one in Prince George, and we breed trees. So there's so for example, spruce has a weevil that knocks the top off, and then eventually it dies. But we've found trees that don't get eaten by weevil, and so we choose those families, we breed those families, and then we clone them. So we, just like you do with an apple tree, take a chunk, you put it on another rootstock, you build 100 of them, and then you take those seed. So none of it's GMO, but it is all farmed.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Sure.
I had a sit-down meeting with the person in charge of the cut blocks for a sawmill that I talked to. I've talked to a couple, but you guys only breed certain kinds of trees that do well for your company, but like as a First Nation, there's like balsam trees, there's alder trees, there's birch trees, there's aspen trees, there's juniper trees, there's all kinds of stuff. There's things that aren't being planted again. And these are things that we utilize and that the animals eat. And so like I really have to wonder why is a sawmill more important than everything that's going to suffer from planting only these two specific, I think maybe 3 kinds of trees?
We plant about 6 to 10. So
okay.
We do.
But it's
yeah,
mostly pine and spruce.
No, not a.
Around here.
Do you guys fight all the time? Like when you
Yes.
have dinner,
Yeah.
if you have family dinners,
we're not allowed
We
to
don't
talk about forestry.
ever.
do
No.
you bust it up? Oh my gosh, like that. You didn't tell me that your sister was. I'm not saying that.
I'm a secret.
No, I
He
mean.
hides me in the closet.
Well,
It's good intel. Yeah.
I'm really concerned about that selection of the best, healthiest, most resistant trees. Because even though they're good for raising crops that will be good for making money in the future, our ecosystems are made up of the pathogens as well as the healthy things. So selecting for the best ones means that there's a whole sequence of organisms that are being disadvantaged by not having the genetics that are weaker. So the rust-prone fungi, the blister rusts, the root rots, the adelgid aphids, the leaders. There's organisms that are part of the ecosystem that need to be there so that we have that full picture, because without them we are not going to be as robust. We need all that stuff to be present. We don't need monocrops that are the best and healthiest trees only.
We don't kill the trees that come in naturally. So like we plant our 1,200 stems per hectare, and then it fills in. So a lot of times when we go back out and survey at year 10, 15, we have 2,000 stems or 3,000 stems per hectare of conifers, birch, aspen, all this other stuff that comes back in. So you're never going to lose the diversity, and we also still have.
Well, hold. Yeah. A good example though, Melissa, is like, you know, a pine stand that got hit with a mountain pine beetle, and 10% of the pine trees didn't die. Like, they might have a genetic adaptation that the pine beetles didn't like. And when we clear cut that and take all those out, that genetic, and then we replace that with this limited seed stock that we've selected for.
Actually, we don't have Class A seed for pine. So we're using natural stock for pine for the most part. We have very little Class A
Okay,
seed.
but it's not the stuff that was left behind by the pine beetle, right? So like,
Yeah,
there's natural selection on the landscape
yes, we do.
that we're interfering with.
We're still collecting cone from trees that survived mountain pine beetle.
I think you guys might have to take this outside. Do you have a question? I think we probably just have time for one more question.
Thank you.
Oh, but hold on, Herb, you've had a lot of questions here. We got to split it up.
There's just one person at the back there.
You can do your radio show and talk all about this stuff. Oh, sorry, the gal's got right behind you. Is going to go first, and she's going to give you the microphone.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering what we can do as like individuals to like help this, or like lessen our consumption.
Well, I mean, Nicole?
Well, I don't know, but it's related to what you were saying earlier, and you were saying about like Health Canada setting MRL, the maximum residue limits, and that's for food, but also, I mean, for forestry, there's the Forest Range Practices Act, I think it is. There's legislation. I mean, if you can be involved in that thing, I think you're right. It does sometimes come from the top. Was it the WHO that said who is it that said that glyphosate's a probable carcinogen?
That's IARC, which is an arm of
And then they took it back. Did they take it back?
No, they did not take it back. They just got taken down by Monsanto. Did you see that they had $17 million for 1 year simply to fight against the IARC regulation? That's the kind of thing that you're up against. And they tried to discredit them. I mean, they tried to discredit them as being flakes. Like Chris Portier, who's a very respected scientist, got taken down with them. They're saying he's a well-paid activist. Oh, for God's sake. Like, he was hardly making anything compared to $17 million in public affairs to fight against that ruling. So they did not retract it. But they've lost funding, et cetera, because of the influence of Monsanto.
I would, like, not to interrupt, but I would say in order to help, I would get a hold of your MLA, your local MLA. I don't know, admit it, BC's unseated, and drop the Canadian government and the Health Canada, and just, right?
But you know what, obviously, the whole idea of, like, we were even just talking about lawns. Like, why lawns? Why do people have lawns? It's meant to be a sign of wealth, that you don't need, to have that land to grow food or to do something else with. And so, I don't know, it's around, and it's also about the perception of what is a weed. Like, what's a weed, what's a plant? Aren't they both the same things, actually? And so, I would say that it is about personal practices and using, the chemicals that you use in your daily life, but also being active. Like, I'm just going to point to this again because I want you all to participate in the action that we're going to do next week. But it's also about what was that? So we were talking at lunch about this Erica Chenoweth article that was published about the small percentage of people that are needed in order to shift, to create change in societies, and it's a really small amount. Like, I think it's 6% or something like that. And that's the kind of thing that if there's enough people who can mobilize and not in an adversarial way, I will say to you, what's your sister's name?
Melissa.
Melissa, not adversarially, but actually as positive change, I think is the way to go. And then there's one more question here, last question, yeah.
A company called TerraGrow on Vancouver Island imports it. No problem. It's legal.
There's no patent.
No.
The patent expired, so anybody can make it, just like generic drugs.
I'd just like to make a point that the question facing the panel was, is forestry, can you do forestry without the use of glyphosate? And the answer is yes, you can. In 1984, Sweden abandoned all use of glyphosate or pesticides in their forests. They have actually, on 2/3 of the land base of BC, they produce twice as much wood as we do.
Well, I mean, like, even though my sister and I sounds like we're disagreeing, she told us that it is possible. This is a serious forester. She's doing forestry without glyphosate. So there you go. Case closed.
So, in Quebec, they banned it in 2001. So
Yeah.
again,
It's just it's a ridiculous debate. It's ridiculous that we have to go up here and organize this and you know, make you guys stay up till 10:30 at night to listen to this panel, and feel free to leave. I mean, we're not holding you here against your will.
I think we should wrap it up.
I appreciate you guys coming out.
And
we could talk about this
especially
all night.
Thank you to our panelists, because thanks for coming, thanks for being part of it. It really made a difference, and your insights were so valuable. And thank all of you to coming out to the film, and just keep the awareness going.
Got one more from Benita.
Oh. Mostly.
They find glyphosate in rain. Okay, it's being recorded in river water. It's recorded in the air. It's everywhere. When they do chemical sampling in the prairies for, actually, there's going to be a really good NRESI lecture. Christy Morrissey from the University of Saskatchewan is going to be lecturing there. She's done a lot of work on neonics and birds in the prairies, and they don't even bother sampling for glyphosate because they just assume it's going to be everywhere.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's so systemic. It's like the question of, I mean, don't believe that you can buy organic honey, because it's just not possible. Nobody can regulate where the bees go, right? So, oh, you have a question.
Oh.
Okay, how do you know that, though?
Because there's no glyphosate spraying around our property.
But how do you know how far the bees are going and where they're going? Okay, and you're sure that a 5-kilometer radius, there's absolutely no glyphosate anywhere on any of the...
No, we're not sure of that.
No,
yeah, I
it's
actually
hard.
had to, sorry.
Sprayed right up to our property.
Spectro,
Look at it on.
they do the maintenance for the alleyways and like along the highway and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they were spraying
Glyphosate.
Yeah, they were spraying, and then we had to stop them because our cats, or dogs, or neighborhood animals, or something could touch the spots or walk through the spots or sniff the spot and carry it into our yard. And then I think there's like a 2-week period that you're supposed to stay clear of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah, we found them. They were right next to our yard, and it was a company called Spectrum, and they were out spraying invasive plants. But what I found was odd was that they never came to us and said, oh, by the way, we're going to spray some glyphosate right next to you. Are you worried about anything? Like, they never said anything. So I had to go out and confront them and ask them for MSDS sheet and then a number for their boss and talk to their boss. And they were told that it was safe and they didn't have protection on. And they were out there with the backpack sprayer ready to spray, and I told them, you should be really, suited up a bit more.
And go away.
Yeah, well, and they were happy to give me the information. I wasn't rude to them in any way. I just wanted to know why they were doing it and why we weren't told, right? So it's not just in the forest, it's right next to your yard too.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Cats, your
everywhere.
dogs.
Okay, guys, we're going to wrap this up. And could everybody
Thank
give
you.
Jennifer a big applause for coming here
Thank you.
tonight, all the way from Toronto. Thanks so much, you guys, for listening.